Hi all, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to present to the viewers exactly how I myself would implement socialism. Since this is an economic discussion, I will leave my social opinions outside as they are not relevant. Leftism is a nebulous movement with many denominations or sects forming, such as market socialism, participatory socialism, syndicalism, mutualism, Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, and so on and so forth. Each of these models, however, feels somewhat incomplete to me, failing to acknowledge at least one or the other tenets of the dynamic reality presented by capitalism. I'll briefly go over the failings of some of the existing rhetoric and establish some of the antecedent logic I use to formulate my own implementation of socialism. Then, last but not least, I will explain how I myself would carry out the new system. Section 1. My revised socialist rhetoric. I contend that in order to implement modern socialism, one must amend the rhetoric somewhat to handle the 21st century environment. The proposed implementations that stem from the 20th century are all in some ways partial and incomplete. Marxist-Leninism could run into a capacity problem, or rather a scalability problem, wherein they are unable to nationalize all industry. Furthermore, Deng's China, Gorbachev, or arguably Khrushchev's USSR, Vietnam during the Doi Moi reform entered liberalization phases, either to move away from their stagnation era, or because of increasing Western pressures, or because of internal sympathies away from their classical models. And Marxism was only supposed to be implemented in fully developed countries, not the developing nations which ultimately sought to implement them. Syndicalists, Marxists, MLs, and other various groups sometimes argue for alternative currency models or abolition of currency, failing to consider that bartering or an alternative currency model ultimately would reconverge towards the original fiat currency model, for example as labor vouchers slowly begin to take on the form of currency in transactions. Distributism, a social market economy based on Catholic teachings and small to medium-sized enterprises, does not push as far to the left as it could, and also runs into a problem of handling corporations of large sizes or multinationals. Anarchist thought often posits either no government at all or an interim government, but one which is of too limited authority to legitimize social contracts and maintain national defense on meaningful levels. And none of these models adequately and organically handle the problem of superstructure within larger enterprises, wherein large firms have multiple layers of executive leadership, intermediate management, hierarchies within their technical base, etc. Transitioning a modern globalized economy into a socialist dream is much harder than transitioning of the pre-capitalist or industrial capitalist societies from 100 years ago, so it requires special handling. There's a lack of consensus on how to transition already globalized economies. Lastly, a purely communist state without a concept of governance is unlikely, given that in our lifetimes, the gradual corrosion of world governments is not a visible future. So all that being said, how would I approach it? For starters, socialism should be a long-term strategy, not something implemented in a day or in a week. I believe in a gradual walk towards socialism, especially for developing nations. A fully developed social democracy can already socialize its economy, since it is ready. But a developing nation would develop based on dirigist or state capitalist economic policy and a robust education system, while still residing within liberalism. Though they can offer social programs around health and education, they don't need to over-nationalize or rush into socialism during this developmental phase. Once that has been established, and the economy is still stable, the nation can then migrate towards its socialization phase. This prevents the incoherent plan the Soviets and the Chinese faced where they had to liberalize their state-run economies. This is also partly done because state-run industrialization is antiquated in a post-industrial era, which is how historically socialist planned economies have developed. Develop within liberalism on the left first. There is no rush. Then socialize. You have all the time in the world. As you push towards socialism, you might want to implement capital controls, such as exchange controls, profit repatriation restrictions, reinvestment requirements and exit taxes, and foreign capital limits to ensure less foreign dependence and prevent capital flight. In practice, you would probably want some sort of socialist charter and coherent, tangible plan of migration, say 30 years or so, irrespective of whether you are a democracy or a single-party state, to demonstrate that you have committed to the movement long-term. Next, no system can operate without currency. Any alternative form of currency, such as Proudhon's mutual credit or Bakunin's labor vouchers, would eventually resurface as currency later on, especially in the face of international trade. Another subtle point. A lot of socialists agree that the community should decide on how to allocate public investment, but don't really know what that entails or how it should be practically implemented. The point here is that socialism is a highly participatory movement, and this participation requires an elaborate orchestration mechanism. Socialism needs to know how to handle large corporations. Specifically, we must create a brand of socialism that understands how to handle the modern concept of superstructure within a large firm that I mentioned earlier. Another principle is that we must redefine what each of the classes contributes to society. Marx naively defined bourgeoisie and proletariat. Here, however, corporate is redefined as the orchestration mechanism of the middle and working classes. The middle classes are redefined as the productive core of society, where technical experts congregate. The working classes are still labor, but are recategorized as non-abused labor, such as the girl who rolls out your Subway sandwich, and abused labor, such as the Bangladeshi who works 12-hour shifts at a sweatshop. Finally, and most importantly, if we shift the goal from labor emancipation to democratization of management and investment, and treat labor emancipation as a byproduct of this reform, we can broaden the socialist landscape tenfold. This is fundamentally the core of my ideology. We can now tilt our perception slightly. We can now contend that the orchestration mechanism in society is overvalued, since the core of productivity stems from the middle classes in society. We can also contend that labor is devalued and should have its value recalibrated. Abused labor is clearly overproductive and thus is reserved the right to be emancipated, whereas non-abused labor can be uplifted to the middle classes in exchange for more skill manifestation, and I'll show you how that would be done later on. Objective statement. Now that we know that the skilled middle classes are the core of productivity of society, we can redefine socialism's objective as congregating society around its middle classes by leaving the current middle classes where they are, devaluing the overvalued orchestration mechanism in society, and re-evaluating labor. Marx wanted to congregate society into its unskilled labor-oriented working classes. We reoriented that objective statement to congregation in the middle classes. Marx's objective statement created a society of low productivity, whereas mine creates a society where high productivity of skilled labor is still rewarded. You may think that I'm just rambling on for no reason, redefining abstract principles, but it's actually leading towards a tangible end. You will see this tangible end right now. Section 2. How I would implement socialism. I mentioned earlier the core of my ideology, that is, the democratization of management and investment, and treating labor emancipation as a byproduct of this reform. What would this look like in practice? Many socialists claim that the workers can collectively own its own means of production and handle distribution to suppliers but cannot guarantee hitting quotas, and many socialists do feel the community should invest on things collectively but have no idea where the investment comes from. I propose that by shifting your perception slightly to the above objective statement, you can resolve both problems. Let's start with the democratization of management. Remember that superstructure stuff I was talking about earlier. Consider, for example, AWS, which has executives at the top level such as CEO, CFO, CTO, etc., and a score of senior directors and directors, then various levels of product managers, followed by tech leads, senior, mid-level, and junior software engineers, etc. They in turn are supplied by the manufacturing bases we as socialists are so interlinked to, with labor managers, supervisors, and the actual workers themselves. Traditional socialist models are not well equipped to handle the collectivization of such an intricate superstructure. Let's piecemeal the problem by starting simply, specifically with labor. For starters, labor management in factories and farms would be democratized through representatives elected to co-management positions. All workers would be rotated in and out of these co-management positions after a certain period, so you could thereby rationalize giving them all co-manager salaries. They would be informally trained in things like inventory and supply chain, either by the original manager who stays on as another co-manager, or from someone upstairs. Unlike capitalism where the firm owns the physical capital, or Marxism and syndicalism where the workers collectively own it, here we would be following a hybrid ownership model, where the Labour Co-Management Board retains hiring and firing rights amongst themselves, so that the firm can't just fire everyone. The workers, as well as the skilled employees, would then receive a profit-shared dividend from the firm. And this co-management board on behalf of the workers would negotiate quotas and socially necessary labor time with the firm. Since the firm has an incentive for high quota production and the workers have an incentive for low quota production, the tug of war within the negotiation would essentially balance that out. If a firm is nationalized, the government would just take over the quota negotiation process with the workers. But really going back to the concept of superstructure, the discussion implies a greater rehashing of the traditional organizational structure. Some argue for worker self-directed enterprises, namely Richard Wolff, and some even within capitalism have posited holacratic models, such as CEO Brian Robertson. I, on the other hand, would suggest a distributed leadership model. I propose the following in line with the new objective statement of devaluing orchestration. Reorganize the managerial structure into cooperative boards. So, for example, a financial oversight board in place of a CFO, a technology and innovation board comprised of the most innovative technical experts and directors instead of a CTO, an executive board in place of a single CEO, comprised of members from their various departments. Each board would incorporate representatives of the next level under executives or employees. Directors and product managers would also have congregated in their own boards, and the directorial and product boards would be democratized to be collectively run by them, and some next level under employees, such as elected PMs in the directorial board, or technical experts in the product boards, for instance, tech leads and senior software engineers. Intentional saturation and dilution. Have more individuals join these boards. Since each member of the board contributes less individual output, since 10 financial officers individually contribute less than just the one former CFO, you can rationalize a gradual devaluation of the orchestration mechanism. Such boards would incorporate mid-tier skilled employees such as the aforementioned tech leads or accountants, such that one could flatten the management structure. Distributed leadership seems unorthodox but is necessary to rationalize devaluing the individual roles played by management, or the average Joe won't accept an executive earning significantly less. One very important side note, there are no stocks or shares in socialism, so the workers' dividend I mentioned earlier is more so along the lines of a patronage refund or something on a fixed predetermined value, rather than linked to the quantity of shares they have. I admit that calling it a dividend is a bit of a misnomer. Since we've created a leftist rehashing of a mutual org, one could say that the board of directors is comprised of members from the various boards rather than a separate group of elite shareholders. By the way, this analysis would apply to both offshore and domestic labor, and if firms wish to expand their operations and increase productive capacity, it would be determined by the voters whether the new physical capital is domestic or offshore. This contribution to management demonstrates that labor is now capable of performing skilled functions and has skill manifestation capabilities, so they deserve a higher place in the hierarchy. In other words, you could say that labor is more intelligent now, so it has earned a higher status. The government could then implement max and min wage caps to further congregate everybody in the middle classes. Now that, by meritocratic standards, the crunching towards the median skilled labor wage is justified, since labor contributes to management and the orchestration has been devalued. These caps could of course rise with inflation, decrease with deflation, or rise with increased GDP. But the key is that they must move in tandem such that the social equality is preserved. Medium-sized firms could follow the same routine, just on a smaller scale, while family-owned businesses and startups could retain their original structure as long as the salaries are more equitable by government cap standards. Mom-and-pop stores in smaller places could easily collectivize their management and would be mandated by law to do so. This strategy addresses the concept of superstructure by compression mechanisms, while still having some division of labor. This reform permeates across all industries, such as commercial banking, agriculture, pharmaceutical industry, technology, etc. Also note that these firms don't all need to be nationalized, since they all behave sort of like socialist mutuals, which means that there can still exist a degree of decentralization that resolves the scalability issue of traditional mass nationalization. That said, the nationalization of land and labor can still exist in the form of any state-owned enterprise. It's just that this model doesn't solely rest on nationalization as previous models did. and I still believe that worker and agrarian co-ops can exist, but that they will always be secondary to these principal reforms. That takes care of democratization of management, but we are not done yet. Consider again a firm operating within capitalism. How do you think the firm receives the investment capital in order to finance its activities? They receive it from investors, VCs, investment banks, and hedge funds. In a socialist economy, you wouldn't have all of that, and also the community would have rights over the firms. So how would you handle all of this? The answer is that you would have the democratized investment as well, not just the management, specifically with a social investment model. In practice, you would want a government-managed social investment fund, and citizens would vote on which firms they felt should be allocated social capital. But that's just a very crude idea. If you're smart and savvy, you would probably want to enhance it somewhat. Specifically, you would want to allocate municipal, provincial, and federal social investment funds that handle local firms, firms with a provincial scope, and firms with a national scope, respectively. Then you would probably want to sectorize and subsectorize these funds. For example, you have a fund for technology sector, and that sector would be divided into subsectors such as cybersecurity and AI/ML or cloud operations. Firms can be grouped happily into multiple subsectors, say for example a firm with both cybersecurity and cloud products. Social capital would be proportioned based on size of industry, so technology or pharmaceutical could receive more than the hardware industry. Social funds would reserve a certain amount of capital for emergency or economic hardship, so that funds would never run out. Under socialism, firms don't work for traditional profit motives as they do under capitalism. So they would be required to recirculate surplus value after payouts and reinvestment to the social investment funds. Remember, since salaries are constrained by max and min wage caps, they can't use the surplus value to fill their own pockets. They might as well just recirculate it back to the public. You would probably want some sort of elaborate financial security mechanism in place, like independent organizations that monitor these social investment funds with legal authority in coordination with the judiciary, to ensure that politicians don't corrupt the funds themselves for their personal use. Remember to create sectoral equity caps and firm size specific minimum and maximum equity allocation thresholds to prevent some sectors from overly dominating and larger firms from crowding out social capital for smaller firms. Now, on to voting. It's naive to say everyone in the community collectively owns the means of production and should vote on where social capital gets allocated. This is essentially what I hear a bunch of socialists all over Reddit saying. For example, consider New York City. There are over 200,000 firms in the Big Apple. It is unlikely that the standard voter would understand all 200,000 of these firms. You would also have to account for the egocentric nature of each voter. Even though in a socialist society the goal is socially necessary products, humans will fundamentally vote for their own firms and against their own competitors. And some members of the community might simply be disinterested or not vote at all. How do you resolve all of this? The answer is to create a model of participatory budgeting of social capital stored in these public investment funds, based on each citizen savvy voting on just a handful of firms. Just like in capitalism, firms hold investor meetings to define their progress. In socialism, firms would hold open doors meetings for members of the public to define their products and progress. Members of the community would be obligated by law to attend at least X such public meetings every 6 months as to ensure their participation, because, recycling that point I brought up earlier, socialism is a highly participatory system by nature. Members of society could not vote within their own subsector to ensure they do not vote for their own firms and against their own competitors. They would be handed a few voting cards, say one for a municipal social fund, one for a provincial social fund, and one for a national social fund, containing all the firms that locally belong to the predefined jurisdiction, such as their district, county, or constituency. The votes would be tallied by independent bodies consisting of members of the public, representatives of the firms, and representatives of government, in order to ensure validity. Social capital would finally be allocated based on the public votes. Since each citizen only votes on a handful of firms, under allocation of social capital is a possibility, in which case the government reserves the right to grant it to underallocated firms based on submitted proposals by those firms. However, the government is not obligated to make any guarantees. So firms without sufficient public investment at the end of the day are incentivized to recreate their products according to the principle of social necessity. In order to finance all of this, investment banks and hedge funds would be nationalized and then be reorchestrated as the arms and legs of the social funds. Superfluous financiers would simply be fired since their sector is outrightly being eliminated, and only those who wish to work at the government wages to orchestrate the social investment allocation remain. Private investors would be obligated to direct any investment to these social funds by an agreed upon deadline upon which private investment would be barred. A minor digression. Commercial banks can remain privatized, granted that they obey the democratized management structure predefined earlier, but during times of low inflation would be ordered to artificially give lower interest rates just enough to cover some basic administration fees. Needless to say, stock markets and complex financial instruments such as derivatives will be eliminated. Since community is now at least the partial owner of these firms, along with the democratized boards, employees, and workers who receive their profit-shared workers' dividend, they receive a social dividend alongside any international investor who contributes a sufficient amount to the social investment funds. The public is then incentivized to increase their social dividend. As mentioned before, the profits are taxed and recirculated into the social investment fund, thus keeping it active and even growing as GDP increases. Socialism seems to be quite bad at handling globalization as well. It doesn't know what to do with international firms. We might not have the capacity or the jurisdiction to nationalize them all. However, this model does posit an answer. International firms would be obligated to cooperate with the democratization of management to the extent of their presence nationally. So if McDonald's has chains locally, their workers would receive co-manager salaries and collectively manage their branch, but still report to the foreign superstructure. Democratization of investment for these firms would be an extension of the previous discussion. Such firms would have to hold public meetings and get enough votes to receive any social capital from the national fund. And that is how to democratize management and investment. Phew, we're almost there. Now, a quick word on housing and the homeless. In terms of housing construction, firms and real estate agencies could be regulated to construct cookie-cutter neighborhoods instead of luxury or working-class apartments. Rent would be abolished since it is passive income, but payment for damages by a tenant would still be in place. To handle the homeless, social workers, specifically psychologists and psychiatrists, would analyze selected homeless individuals and group them into one of several categories. Psychiatric instability, in which case they would be directed to a mental hospital involuntarily and the government would pay the fees. Drug or alcohol-related addiction, in which case they would be directed to a rehabilitation facility involuntarily and government would pay this fee. Disabled, in which case they're entitled to a government apartment or housing. And disabilities insurance. Of sound mind and body, in which case they are handed government apartment or housing and government manual labor jobs such as street sweeper or street painter. To finish off, I'll discuss inflation and stagflation. The left seems to historically have a crisis when it comes to mastering inflation and stagflation. Let's assume stagflation occurs in this model, since abused labor is less productive now under reformed quota and work time than it was under abusive 12-hour shifts, thus shifting the aggregate supply curve down, but aggregate demand increases since the wage share of the working and middle classes has increased, and citizens are not saving or investing enough of their new allocation. Also, since firms now incur increased labor costs, they could raise prices to cover their costs, leading to cost-push inflation. In this case, the solution is for the firms to expand their productive capacity. The government could effectively subsidize the cost of some physical capital, land, factories, and key industries, such that some major firms only incur the cost of the additional labor, so that they could shift their aggregate supply curve back to the right and keep their prices lower, thus reducing the inflation. Demand-driven inflation could also occur if aggregate demand skyrockets, but this is unlikely in a system of high progressive taxation, which would moderate excessive demand from formerly wealthier households. Section 3. Conclusion. The model has many advantages. For starters, unlike the Soviet model, the government does not need to nationalize everything, since social equality has been already obtained. Only investment banks, hedge funds, and strategic nationalizations such as in Dirigism, such as of some resource-heavy firms to reserve their resources for national development, and overly profitable enterprises to divert their excess capital into social programs. So you don't need a benevolent central planner who is tasked with debunking the ECP. And you don't need to overnationalize if you don't feel like doing so. Furthermore, these measures ensure social equality while maintaining the advantages of international trade afforded to by remaining on currency and ensuring productivity. It also efficiently handles inflation and stagflation more robustly than previous socialist implementations. It changes the objective statement from working class mobilization to congregation in the middle classes. It emancipates labor as a byproduct of democratization of management and capital, as opposed to a naive approach like WSDEs or state-run industrialization. It mitigates the dynamism of capitalism by handling superstructure. It is exogenous to whether you are a developing or developed nation, how you stand on social issues, whether you are a democracy or a single-party state. That said, I recommend you have at least some partial checks and balances if you are a single-party state, because the politicians will almost certainly try to corrupt the social investment funds. Markets and prices do exist, but merely as a system of exchange rather than one of stocks, derivatives, and other financial instruments. The pros of such a system are numerous. The cons are that it requires a long-term commitment by a nation. Say, for example, 5 to 10 years for a developed nation to migrate and 20 to 30 for a developing nation, and that it is heavily reliant on participation of citizens in voting, not only on political issues but also periodically, say every 6 months or so, on social investment issues. My proposed model is overall a synthesis of market socialism, participatory socialism, distributed leadership, profit-sharing mechanisms, and some co-opted Marxist direct democracy with some state-run directives. Well, there you have it. That's all, gang. Let me know what you thought. If you liked this video, be sure to like, share, or subscribe. Thanks for watching.